Good morning, friends. As John said earlier, my name is Rob Hardies, and I am delighted to be with you this morning. I'm coming to you from just down Route 50 in Washington, D.C., where for the last 19 years, I served as senior minister of All Souls Church. Thanks for having me this morning, and thanks to Reverend John and Reverend Anastasia for inviting me. You know, it's been my pleasure to know both Reverend John and Reverend Anastasia for many years now, and I just want to congratulate all of you at UUCA for having the wisdom to assemble such a fine ministry team. Congratulations. As I was preparing my sermon for you this week, I remembered something about my connection to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Annapolis. I remembered that the first time I ever set foot in your church was 20 years ago last month. I wonder how many of you were with the church 20 years ago. For me, it was an auspicious occasion. You see, I had just graduated from seminary and I was interviewing to become the minister of All Souls in Washington, and you all had offered your pulpit to me to give my pre-candidating sermon, my audition sermon. So the search committee from All Souls drove me up from DC one Sunday morning. Paula Cole-Jones was the chair of my search committee. I think some of you know Paula. And I gave my sermon that morning, and I'm told that sometime between the first and second services, the search committee met in a little room off the sanctuary and decided that I was their choice to be All Souls' next minister. That was a big day for me. And you all helped make it happen 20 years ago last month. So let me say to you all a belated thank you for your hospitality back then, and it's good to be back. My sermon this morning is called Love Always. And I want to begin with a story told by the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray. A story she shared about her son from a time when he was just a toddler. The story goes that one night, Reverend Frederick Gray found her son standing fully clothed in the shower. I don't believe the water was running. And with him there in the shower were a dozen or so of his favorite stuffed animals. Intrigued, Reverend Frederick Gray asked her son, "Hey, what are you up to, bud? Why'd you bring all your animals into the bathroom?" "Mommy," he said, "it's shower church." And he said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world, shower church. Curious now, his mom asked him, "Well, okay, tell me a little bit more about shower church." So the boy explained to his mother that at shower church, he preaches a sermon to his stuffed animals in the shower. Now, I'll bet at that point, Reverend Frederick Gray couldn't help but smile. Her son, after all, is the child of not one, but two preachers. So, of course, shower church. Of course, he's play acting, preaching. After he explained shower church to her, his mother asked the boy the obvious next question. "Well, so what are you preaching on? What's your sermon about?" And he gave her a look like she had just asked the silliest question in the world. Like, how could she not know the answer to that question? He said to her, "Love, Mommy. It's always about love." Sometimes we think our children aren't paying attention. But apparently her son had been listening all those years to his mother's sermon. Apparently he'd been paying attention to his religious education teachers. He'd been noticing folks at church as they cared for one another and engaged together in the work of justice. And while still a toddler, the boy had already discovered that at the core of our Unitarian Universalist faith is love. Always love. Now, there'd be time later for him to discover that our embodiment of love is never perfect, that sometimes even in church we fail to love one another. Sometimes we let each other down. There'd be time for him to learn that even when we do love one another, sometimes our love is not enough to save the people and the causes that we care about. We know that. And there'd be time for him to learn that too. But for now, the boy had discovered a foundation upon which to build a lifetime of faith. And that foundation is love. I learned a similar lesson about church when I was a young boy. I grew up in a small Presbyterian church in upstate New York. And I'll never forget when our longtime pastor retired and we hired a new minister, Reverend Dottie. Now, this was back in the 1980s, and Reverend Dottie was the first woman minister in the history of our congregation. Back then, it was still rare to see a woman in the pulpit. So it was kind of a big deal when Reverend Dottie came to our church. And what I remember most about Reverend Dottie is that she was a hugger. And I'm not just talking about a little pat on the back kind of hug. I'm talking about a great big hug. Reverend Dottie gave out hugs like they were a sacrament of the church, like communion or something. She was a large woman, and as a little boy, I remember that she just wrapped me up in her arms and hold me tight against her and not let go until I knew I was loved. And as she hugged me, she'd say to me, "I love you." But it wasn't her words that made that love real. It was the hug. It was those hugs that taught me as a young boy that church was about love. Always love. And they taught me another thing. They taught me that in church, at least, love isn't just some warm, fuzzy feeling or some abstract principle we talk about. Love is something we do. It's an action, a practice. It's something we share with someone else, like a hug or an encouraging word, or like visiting someone when they're sick. Dottie taught me that in the church, love is expressed through tangible acts of care and affection. When Reverend Dottie came to our church, she was determined to shake things up. One of the things she did was she took the church masthead. You know, the place in the bulletin where it lists the church staff? And she moved things around. Instead of her name at the top, the masthead began Somerville Presbyterian Church. Ministers, every member of this church. And beneath that, it said, Pastor, the Reverend Dorothea Yoder. That too was a revelation to me. Back then I thought, well, the minister and staff of the church are the ones who do the ministry, right? I mean, after all, that's what we pay them for. When, of course, the ministry of the church is all our work. All the love that we create here at church, we create together. Our care for one another, the education of our children, our work for justice. It's not just on the shoulders of one or two people. It's the responsibility of each and every one of us. Later in life, I discovered that there was a name for this. We call it shared ministry, which means, very simply, the church's love is all our responsibility. Now, I know I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but I don't think it hurts to be reminded from time to time of our shared responsibility for the church's ministry of love. Over 20 years in ministry, I've learned that it's easy to fall back into the narrative that the love of the church is somebody else's responsibility, something that's done for us or on our behalf. It's easy to think like this because it's the way most of our culture works, right? Most of our culture is governed by a contractual consumerist mentality. We walk into a grocery store, for example, or a restaurant or any business, and we expect to receive something. And in exchange for that, we know we've got to pay for it. That's the contract. Simple. Church isn't like that. We don't do contracts in church. We do covenants. And a covenant is nothing more and nothing less than the promise we make to one another to share the love. Not perfectly, not infallibly, but faithfully. I think Alice Walker put it so well when she said, people don't come to church to find God. They come to church to share God with one another. We don't come to church to have love or wisdom handed to us. We come to share it with one another, to discover it together. That's our covenant. That's our promise to one another. Now, this covenant we have with one another, it often operates on an unspoken level. Sometimes we forget it's even there. And then sometimes something happens that reminds us of our promise to one another to share the love. My friend and colleague, the Reverend Kim Crawford Harvey, tells a story about one such time. It's a story about a man who was working as a clerk at a gay bookstore. Now, already I've dated this story by locating it in a gay bookstore, right? This was back when there still were gay bookstores and when they were really a hub of the LGBTQ community. Before the rise of online culture, these bookstores served like community centers, almost like community centers. They were a place you could go to find your people and to find support. Anyway, Kim tells the story of how one night at the bookstore, the phone rang and the clerk answered. But the caller wasn't looking for a book. The caller was a distraught young man who thought he might be gay and who wasn't sure that he could live with this truth about himself, wasn't sure that his family and community would accept him for who he was. Now, the bookstore clerk was no counselor, but he figured as long as he stayed on the line with this young man, he'd be okay. So he just kept listening and talking to the young man. But as the conversation went on, a line began to form at the cash register. Folks were waiting to pay for their books. And the longer the conversation went on, the longer the line grew. And the clerk started stressing out. On one hand, he didn't want to get off the phone with this young man. On the other hand, he could see his customers impatiently checking their watches, and clerk didn't know what to do. Finally, one of the customers who had been waiting in line a long time came up to the clerk and tapped him on the shoulder, and the clerk thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble now. But the woman said to him, here, give me the phone. It's my turn. And she took the phone from the clerk and she started speaking with the young man. The clerk went back to ringing up his customers, and after they paid for their books, some of them too took a turn talking with the young man. Because that's how covenant works. That's how love works. In the church, in any beloved community. The covenant is our promise to one another to share the love. It's not the responsibility of just one or two people. We all stand in line and take our turn and do our part. Now, friends, I share this message with you this morning because sometime in the near future, God willing, you will all gather again in person and face to face. And when you do, you will meet one another in a world that has been transformed since you were last together. A world transformed by this COVID pandemic and all that it's taken from us. A world transformed by intransigent racial injustice. A world transformed by unprecedented attacks on our democracy and by the existential crisis of climate change. And in this new world, in this new normal, we will need one another's love more than ever. And the world will need the love of this congregation more than ever. So now, more than ever, we must be faithful to the covenant, faithful to our promise to one another. Now is the time for us all to stand in line and take our turn and do our part to share the love. Amen.